The atmosphere of the station was thick, with the scent of recycled ozone and the metallic tang of cooling superconductors, a sharp contrast to the sterile, pressurized void that waited just beyond the reinforced plating of the outer hull. High Commander Kaelen stood before the primary viewing aperture, his eyes tracking the slow, rhythmic rotation of the gas giant below, its swirling bands of violet and gold, a silent witness to the frantic preparations occurring within the human enclave. Every vibration that hummed through the deck plates spoke of urgency, a symphony of industrial necessity that had defined human existence since the Great Migration. They were a species built on the wreckage of their own history, scavengers of physical laws who had learned to weld hope out of discarded carbon and sheer desperation. Behind him, the command deck was a hive of controlled chaos, where technicians spoke in low, rapid bursts of data-heavy jargon, their hands dancing over interfaces that translated the incomprehensible math of fold space into something a pilot could survive. There were no grand speeches here, no anthems of glory or stirring calls to arms, because humanity had long ago traded the luxury of sentiment for the cold efficiency of the survival margin. They knew that the encroaching fleet of the Vok'Thar was not driven by malice or ideology, but by the same biological imperative that drove a wildfire to consume a forest. It was a hungry, mindless expansion that saw the human territories not as a rival civilization, but as an inconvenient pocket of high-density matter to be reclaimed. Kaelen turned away from the stellar display as the heavy blast doors cycled open, admitting a courier whose uniform was stained with the gray dust of the fabrication levels. The messenger did not offer a salute, for such formalities had withered away in the face of total mobilization, instead handing over a data tablet that glowed with the amber light of a Priority 1 intercept. The report confirmed what the long-range sensors had only hinted at during the previous shift. The vanguard of the Vok'Thar swarm had exited slipstream at the edge of the Uit cloud, their mass shadows disrupting the gravitational stability of the outer rim. It was a force 10 times the size of the human defense fleet, a wall of living ships that breathed plasma and thought in collective pulses. The High Commander felt the familiar, cold knot of pragmatism tighten in his chest as he processed the numbers, calculating the exact minute when the first kinetic impacts would begin to strip away the station's shielding. He knew that the strategy they had spent 3 decades perfecting, the desperate gamble known as the kinetic feedback loop, depended entirely on the human's ability to withstand a level of atmospheric pressure that would liquefy most known biological life. It was a uniquely human realization that their greatest weapon was not their technology, but their sheer, stubborn refusal to die in the environments they had built for themselves. The room remained focused, the sound of ventilation fans providing a constant backdrop to the clicking of keys and the soft hum of diagnostic sweeps. There was a profound sense of shared purpose that transcended the individual, a collective understanding that they were currently the only thing standing between the Vok'Thar and the last remaining nursery ships where the civilian population waited in cryostasis. Kaelen walked toward the central holomap, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the grated floor, and tapped a command to highlight the tactical grid of the sector. The blue icons of human frigates looked pitifully small against the encroaching red tide of the enemy fleet, like pebbles attempting to divert a landslide. Yet humanity had spent generations learning how to turn the very laws of physics into a lever, using gravity wells and thermal pockets as force multipliers that defied the standard doctrines of interstellar warfare. They did not have the numbers, and they certainly did not have the raw firepower of their pursuers, but they possessed a mastery of improvised engineering born from the necessity of living in the cracks of the galaxy. Every ship in the fleet was a masterpiece of jury-rigged systems, held together by high tensile polymers and a stubborn belief that if a machine could still move, it could still kill. "Initiate the vacuum seal protocols for the lower decks," Kaelen commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline-fueled pounding of his heart. "If we are going to make this stand, I want every scrap of power diverted from the life support systems to the magnetic containment fields. We can breathe through the emergency tanks for the next 6 hours, but we won't be breathing at all if those shields buckle under the first volley." The technicians nodded, their movements synchronized as they executed the orders, and the lights in the command deck dimmed to a dull crimson as the station shifted into a combat-ready energy state. This was the moment of transition, the point where the abstract planning of a lifetime met the brutal reality of the vacuum. Kaelen looked at his hands, noting the slight tremor in his fingers, and clenched them into fists. He was a man who had seen planets burned to cinders, who had watched stars go cold under the shroud of enemy harvesters, and yet he still felt the primitive urge to protect the small, fragile pocket of air he called home. Humanity was a species of architects who had spent their entire history building walls, and now they were going to find out if those walls were strong enough to hold back the end of the world. As the first ripples of the Vok'Thar warpexit reached the station, the structural integrity alarms began to wail, a dissonant chord that vibrated through the very marrow of everyone on board. The enemy ships were not sleek or metallic. They were jagged, obsidian structures that looked like shards of a broken moon, propelled by bioluminescent engines that bled radiation into the surrounding space. They moved with a predatory grace, fanning out into a pincer maneuver designed to crush the human defense before it could even deploy its primary ordnance. Kaelen watched the tactical display as the red dots began to swarm the blue, the distance closing with terrifying speed. He knew that the first few minutes of the engagement would be the most critical, a test of whether their localized gravity anchors could hold against the massive gravitational shearing forces generated by the Vok'Thar warp drives. If the anchors held, they could force the enemy into a close-quarters brawl where the human superior maneuverability in high-gravity environments would finally give them an edge. If they failed, the station would be torn apart like paper in a hurricane, its inhabitants scattered into the void before they could even fire a shot. The first salvo of plasma fire struck the station's outer shields with the force of a tectonic shift, sending a shockwave through the hull that knocked several technicians from their seats. Kaelen gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles white as he watched the shield integrity percentages plummet. "Hold the line," he whispered, more to himself than to the crew, his eyes fixed on the timer that counted down to the activation of the kinetic feedback loop. They needed the enemy to get closer, to commit their heavy hitters to the assault, so that the feedback pulse could catch them in its overlapping fields. It was a trap that required the humans to play the role of the victim, to take the punishment until the very last second before snapping the jaws shut. Around him, the command deck was filled with the smell of scorched wiring and the sharp, ozone-heavy air of failing capacitors, but no one moved to abandon their post. They were the descendants of those who had survived the Great Famine, the solar flares, and the first contact wars. They were a lineage of survivors who understood that the only way to beat a superior force was to be more willing to bleed for every inch of ground. Outside, the vacuum was lit by the brilliant, terrifying flashes of detonating torpedoes and the emerald beams of the Vok'Thar cutting lasers. Human interceptors darted between the massive enemy hulks like silver needles, their pilots pulling maneuvers that would have crushed the internal organs of any other species. This was the result of centuries of genetic adaptation and high-G training, a biological evolution driven by the harsh environments of the outer rim colonies. The human body had become a machine capable of withstanding the impossible, a vessel for a mind that could calculate trajectories while being crushed into a pilot's seat by 10 gravities of force. As the battle raged, Kaelen felt a grim sense of pride in his people. They were small, they were outnumbered, and they were hopelessly outgunned, yet they fought with a ferocity that seemed to confuse the collective intelligence of the Vok'Thar. The enemy was used to conquest being an exercise in arithmetic, a simple matter of overwhelming force meeting a weaker resistance, but humanity was an anomaly that refused to be solved by standard equations. The timer reached 0, and for a heartbeat, the station went deathly quiet as the main reactors flickered and died. Then a pulse of pure, raw kinetic energy erupted from the station's core, channeled through the gravity anchors and amplified by the very plasma fire the Vok'Thar had been pouring into the shields. It was a ripple in the fabric of space itself, a physical manifestation of the human will to endure, and it hit the enemy vanguard with the impact of a collapsing star. The obsidian ships, caught in the overlapping fields of the feedback loop, began to vibrate until their structural bonds shattered, turning them into clouds of jagged debris that were then hurled back into the following ranks of the swarm. It was a massacre of physics, a demonstration of what happened when a species spent its entire history learning how to turn its own weaknesses into weapons. Kaelen watched as the red dots on the map flickered and vanished by the hundreds, the Vok'Thar formation breaking apart in the face of an attack they had no way to predict or counter. Yet, even as the first wave was decimated, the High Commander knew this was only the beginning. The Vok'Thar were a billion-strong collective, and the force they had just defeated was merely a probing finger of a much larger hand. He looked at the readings coming in from the long-range arrays and saw the true scale of the horror that awaited them. A second wave, larger than the first, was already transitioning out of the void, their sensors locked onto the station's heat signature. The victory had been a brief reprieve, a moment of breath in a marathon of suffocation. Kaelen wiped a smudge of soot from his forehead and looked at his weary crew, seeing the same exhaustion and grim determination mirrored in their eyes. They had survived the first hour, but the war was measured in years, and the station was only one small outpost in a galaxy that was rapidly becoming a graveyard. He knew that the only way forward was to keep fighting, to keep innovating, and to keep being the most stubborn, resilient thing in the universe. "Recharge the anchors," he said, his voice cracking with fatigue but remaining firm. "Prepare for the second wave. We aren't done yet." The logistical nightmare of the defense was now the primary concern for the remaining officers on the deck. While the first strike had been successful, it had drained the station's primary power cells to a level that bordered on catastrophic. Engineering reports were flooding in, detailing breached conduits and melted cooling vents that would take days to repair, days they didn't have. Kaelen authorized the use of the experimental thorium salts in the secondary reactors, a move that would surely contaminate the lower levels but would provide the necessary surge to bring the magnetic bottle back online. He was making choices that would have been unthinkable a year ago, sacrificing sections of the station's future for the slim hope of a present. This was the calculus of survival that defined the human condition in the current era, a constant trade-off between the preservation of life and the maintenance of the tools required to protect it. Every breath taken was a resource spent, every light that flickered on was a watt diverted from the defense grids. As the second wave of Vok'Thar ships closed the distance, the nature of the battle changed from a tactical engagement to a desperate siege. The enemy had learned from the feedback loop and were now keeping their distance, using long-range kinetic harpoons to reel the station into their midst, where they could use their superior numbers to dismantle it piece by piece. Kaelen watched as the massive cables of solidified energy lashed out from the obsidian ships, snagging on the station's protruding antennae and sensor arrays. The station groaned, the sound of twisting metal echoing through the corridors like the death rattle of a giant. The internal gravity fluctuated wildly, sending equipment and personnel tumbling across the deck as the Vok'Thar began to pull, their collective engines straining to drag the human stronghold into the heart of their swarm. It was a slow, agonizing process of being reeled in like a fish, and Kaelen knew that if they didn't break the tether soon, the structural integrity of the hull would simply give way under the tension. "Target the harpoon emitters," Kaelen shouted over the roar of the structural alarms. "I don't care if we have to fire our own lifeboats at them, get those lines off us." The tactical officer, a woman whose face was a mask of sweat and concentration, began slaving the station's point defense turrets to a manual override. They were out of guided missiles, and the main cannons were still cooling, leaving them with only the short-range railguns and the sheer ingenuity of their targeting algorithms. The railguns opened fire, sending slugs of depleted uranium screaming into the void at a significant fraction of the speed of light. Each impact was a tiny star against the dark hull of the Vok'Thar ships, and one by one, the glowing harpoon tethers began to snap. The station shuddered with each release, the recoil vibrating through the floors and rattling the teeth of everyone on board. It was a brutal, ugly form of combat, lacking the elegance of the high-tech maneuvers seen in the inner systems, but it was what the humans had left. In the midst of the chaos, a small realization dawned on Kaelen. The Vok'Thar were not just trying to destroy them, they were trying to capture them. The harpoons weren't designed to shatter the station, but to hold it still so that boarding pods could be launched. This was a shift in strategy that suggested the Vok'Thar had identified something within the station, perhaps the technology behind the feedback loop that they wanted for their own collective. The thought sent a chill down Kaelen's spine that was colder than the vacuum outside. If the Vok'Thar integrated human engineering into their own biological structures, the rest of the galaxy wouldn't stand a chance. Humanity's greatest advantage was their unpredictability, their ability to make machines do things they weren't designed to do. If the enemy gained that capability, the war would be over before the next sun rose. He looked at the internal security monitors and saw the first of the boarding pods breaching the hull on the lower levels, their jagged mandibles chewing through the reinforced plating as if it were soft wax. "Security teams to the fabrication decks," Kaelen ordered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Engagement Protocol 0. Use everything, welders, chemical sprays, heavy machinery. Do not let them reach the core." He knew what Engagement Protocol 0 meant. It was a directive for total resistance, where the life of the defender was secondary to the destruction of the intruder. It was the ultimate expression of human defiance, a statement that they would rather burn their own house down with themselves inside than let an intruder take it. As the first reports of close-quarters combat began to filter back to the command deck, Kaelen felt a heavy sense of inevitability. They were fighting for time, for every second that could be bought with blood and steel. He looked at the timer for the next feedback pulse, seeing that they were still 15 minutes away from being able to fire it again. 15 minutes was an eternity when the enemy was already inside the walls, breathing your air and slaughtering your people. The combat on the lower decks was a nightmare of cramped corridors and zero visibility conditions. Human security forces, clad in pressurized hardsuits, fought with a savage intensity that matched the Vok'Thar's own biological ferocity. They used mining lasers to slice through the chitinous armor of the intruders, and when the power packs for the lasers failed, they used combat knives and their own hands. It was a primitive, visceral struggle that stripped away the veneer of spacefaring civilization, revealing the predatory core that had allowed humanity to survive the caves of their ancestors. In the dark, narrow passageways, the Vok'Thar's superior numbers were neutralized by the humans' knowledge of their own environment. They used the station's plumbing and ventilation as weapons, venting superheated steam and toxic coolants into the paths of the advancing swarm. It was a war of attrition where the environment itself was an active participant, a hostile labyrinth designed to kill anything that didn't belong. Up on the command deck, Kaelen watched the flickering icons of his security teams as they were slowly snuffed out one by one. He could hear their breathing over the comms, ragged, desperate, and then suddenly silenced. He felt every death like a physical blow, a weight added to the burden he had been carrying since the war began. He was the one who had ordered them to stay, the one who had turned this station into a graveyard in the hope of saving the species. It was a heavy price to pay, and he wondered, not for the first time, if they were truly saving anything at all. If the cost of survival was the loss of everything that made them human, their compassion, their art, their peace, then what would be left when the dust finally settled? But then he looked at the technician sitting next to him, a young man who was humming a toneless tune as he worked to bypass a fried circuit, and he saw the answer. Humanity wasn't found in the grand gestures or the high ideals. It was found in the small, stubborn acts of defiance, in the refusal to give up even when the odds were impossible. The Vok'Thar were now only 3 levels away from the primary reactor core. Kaelen could feel the vibrations of their approach through the soles of his boots, a rhythmic thudding that sounded like the heartbeat of a monster. He reached for the manual override for the reactor's cooling system, his hand hovering over the lever that would flood the lower decks with radioactive coolant, killing everything in its path. It was the final failsafe, a scorched earth policy that would buy them the final 5 minutes they needed for the pulse. He hesitated, his mind racing through the names of the men and women still fighting down there, people he had known for years, people who had families waiting for them on the nursery ships. Then he looked at the tactical display and saw the Vok'Thar main fleet moving into position for a final, crushing blow. If he didn't act now, the station would fall and the nursery ships would be next. There was no other choice. With a silent apology to the dead and the dying, he pulled the lever. A low moan echoed through the station as the coolant pumps reversed, and for a moment, the screams over the comms were deafening before they were cut short by the roar of the rushing liquid. Kaelen closed his eyes, his head bowing as he felt the weight of the lives he had just extinguished. But the strategy worked. The Vok'Thar advance was halted as the lower levels were turned into a lethally radioactive tomb. The enemy's progress stopped, their collective mind momentarily reeling from the sheer ruthlessness of the human defense. They had expected a battle of technology and strategy, but they had found themselves in a war with a species that was willing to kill its own to deny the enemy a victory. It was a level of commitment that the Vok'Thar, for all their biological complexity, could not fully comprehend. It gave the humans the window they needed. "Pulse at 100%, the tactical officer announced, her voice hollow and devoid of emotion. "Targeting arrays locked. We have a clear window to the enemy flagship." Kaelen looked up, his eyes hard and cold. He didn't feel like a hero, and he didn't feel like a commander. He felt like a survivor who had done what was necessary. "Fire," he said, and the word was a release of all the tension that had been building since the first alarm. The second kinetic feedback pulse was even more powerful than the first, a concentrated beam of gravitational distortion that tore through the vacuum like a physical blade. It struck the Vok'Thar flagship, a mountain of obsidian that had seemed invincible, and for a moment the ship seemed to freeze in place. Then it imploded, its massive structure collapsing in on itself before exploding outward in a blinding flash of light that lit up the entire sector. The remaining Vok'Thar ships, their collective connections severed by the destruction of their flagship, began to drift aimlessly or retreat into the void. The immediate threat was over, the siege broken by a margin of seconds and a mountain of corpses. Kaelen stood in the flickering light of the command deck, watching the remnants of the enemy fleet scatter. He knew that this was only one battle, and that the Vok'Thar would return with even greater force. He knew that the station was crippled and that they had lost nearly half their crew. But as he looked around at the survivors, the tired, bloodied and broken people who had held the line, he felt a surge of something that wasn't quite hope, but was close enough to it. They were still here. They were still breathing. And as long as there was one human left with a wrench and a will to fight, the galaxy would have to earn every inch of their destruction. He took a deep breath of the scorched, recycled air and began the long process of rebuilding for the next fight. The aftermath of the engagement left the station in a state of suspended animation, a metallic carcass drifting through the debris of its own narrow escape. In the wake of the kinetic pulse, the internal sensors were a jagged mess of false positives and dead zones, leaving the remaining crew to navigate by touch and the flickering glow of emergency chem lights. High Commander Kaelen moved through the corridors of the upper habitation ring, his boots crunching on fragments of crystalline structural plating that had shattered during the final gravitational surge. The silence was the most unsettling part. After hours of screaming alarms and the roar of venting gases, the sudden stillness felt like a weight pressing against his eardrums. He reached a junction where the bulkheads had buckled inward, the heavy durasteel warped as if by the hands of a titan. It was here that the reality of their situation became most apparent, not in the grand tactical maps of the command deck, but in the physical ruin of the life support conduits that peeked through the gaps in the wall like the veins of a wounded animal. He entered the secondary engineering bay, a cavernous space that had been repurposed into a triage center for both machines and people. The smell of burnt insulation was overpowering, mixed with the copper tang of blood and the sharp, antiseptic sting of automated medkits. Chief Engineer Vahn was hunched over a localized power coupling, his hands buried deep in a nest of sparking wires, his face illuminated by the intermittent flash of a welding torch. There was no greeting between the two men. They had existed in each other's orbits for too long for the vanity of rank to matter in the dark. Vahn pulled his hands back, his fingers stained with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and carbon scoring, and looked at the commander with eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in the span of a single afternoon. The report he gave was not one of numbers or percentages, but of physical limits reached and surpassed, of systems that were being held together by nothing more than the collective will of a dozen exhausted mechanics. The primary problem was the radiation that had flooded the lower levels during the emergency coolant purge. While it had successfully halted the Vok'Thar advance, it had also turned the station's industrial heart into a forbidden zone that few could enter and none could survive for long. Kaelen watched as a group of technicians prepared a remote-operated drone, their movements sluggish from the effects of the low-oxygen environment. They were trying to reach the primary atmosphere scrubbers, which had been choked by the soot of the boarding party's thermal cutters. If they couldn't clear the vents, the carbon dioxide levels in the remaining pressurized sections would become lethal within 12 hours. It was a race against their own biology, a reminder that for all their technological prowess, humans were still just fragile bags of water and oxygen held together by a thin layer of atmosphere. The drones, however, were struggling. The electromagnetic interference from the cooling thorium salts was scrambling their signals, making the delicate work of repairing the scrubbers nearly impossible from a distance. "We have to send someone in," Vahn said, his voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "The drones are blind down there. Someone has to go into the radiation zone, manually reset the scrubber cycles, and then manually seal the primary cooling valves before the whole reactor goes critical. We're looking at a 3-minute window of exposure before the cellular damage becomes irreversible." Kaelen looked at the heavy lead-lined suits hanging on the wall, their thick visors reflecting the dim light of the bay. He knew what Vahn was asking, and he knew who would have to go. In the old world, there would have been a volunteer process, a moment of heroic sacrifice recorded for the history books. Here, in the cold reality of the deep void, it was simply a matter of who had the steadiest hands and the least to lose. The two men stood in the flickering light, the hum of the failing generators providing a funeral dirge for the choice they were about to make. Before Kaelen could respond, a young technician named Thorn stepped forward from the shadows of the tool racks. He was barely 20 years old, a child of the migration who had never known the feeling of a natural wind or the warmth of a real sun. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a strange, quiet resolve. He didn't say anything at first, just reached for one of the heavy suits and began to check the seals on the gauntlets. It was an act of profound, mundane bravery that struck Kaelen harder than any of the Vok'Thar plasma volleys. This was what humanity had become, a species where even the children understood the mathematics of the greater good. Thorn knew that his life was a small price to pay for the 6,000 souls currently huddling in the darkened corridors of the station. He wasn't looking for glory, he was looking to ensure that there was a tomorrow for someone else. The process of suit-up was done in total silence, the only sounds being the hiss of pressurized seals and the clank of heavy tools being clipped to Thorn's utility belt. Kaelen watched as the boy disappeared inside the bulky, ungainly armor, his humanity replaced by a faceless silhouette of lead and ceramic. When the helmet was locked into place, Thorn's voice came over the localized comms, sounding tinny and distant. He asked for the technical schematics for the scrubber bypass one last time, his tone as methodical as if he was studying for a routine maintenance exam. Vahn provided the data, his hands shaking slightly as he handed over the tablet. Then the inner airlock door opened, revealing the dark, shimmering haze of the irradiated zone. Thorn stepped through, and the door hissed shut, leaving those in the engineering bay to watch his progress through a flickering, static-filled video feed. The journey through the lower decks was a descent into a mechanical underworld. The footage from Thorn's suit camera showed walls that were coated in a fine layer of radioactive dust, the air shimmering with the heat of the unshielded reactor. Every step he took was a struggle, the heavy suit fighting against the warped deck plates and the piles of debris left behind by the combat. He passed the bodies of the security teams and the Vok'Thar, frozen in their final moments of struggle, now joined in a silent, glowing tomb. Thorn didn't look at them. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, his breathing coming in heavy, rhythmic gasps that filled the comms. Kaelen and Vahn watched the dosimeter readings on the side of the screen, the numbers climbing with terrifying speed as Thorn moved deeper into the station's bowels. They were witnessing the slow dissolution of a human life in real time, a sacrifice being measured in millisieverts. Thorn reached the scrubber room, a cramped space filled with massive, vertical cylinders that were meant to breathe for the station. The room was a mess of tangled pipes and leaking steam, the heat causing the suit's external sensors to scream in protest. Thorn ignored the alarms, his hands moving with a desperate precision as he began to unbolt the primary access hatch. The metal was so hot that even through the insulated gloves, he had to work in short bursts to avoid burning his skin. He was fighting against the clock and the invisible fire of the radiation, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as the exposure began to affect his motor functions. "I'm at the bypass," he whispered, his voice cracking, "starting the sequence now." He began to turn the manual override wheel, his entire body straining against the resistance of the rusted mechanism. On the monitor, they could see the wheels slowly begin to move, a quarter turn at a time, until the first of the scrubbers groaned back to life. As the air began to circulate again, a soft cheer went up from the technicians in the engineering bay, but it was quickly silenced as the dosimeter on Thorn's suit hit the red line. He still had the cooling valves to seal, the most dangerous part of the mission. He stumbled away from the scrubbers, his gait uneven, moving toward the reactor housing. The radiation here was thick enough to cause the camera feed to break apart into jagged blocks of color, but they could still see him reaching for the final lever. He fell once, twice, his suit clanging against the floor, but each time he dragged himself back up. He was a creature of pure momentum now, his mind focused on a single, final task. When he finally reached the valve and pulled it closed, the roar of the venting thorium subsided, replaced by the low, steady hum of a stabilizing reactor. Thorn slumped against the wall, his head lolling back as the final flicker of the camera feed showed the mission was a success. "Thorn, get out of there," Vahn shouted into the comms, his voice breaking. "You did it, son. Just move back to the airlock. We're opening the doors now." There was no response from the suit, only the sound of ragged, wet breathing. Thorn didn't move. He stayed slumped against the reactor housing, a small, leaden figure in the heart of the storm. He had given everything he had to give, and there was nothing left for the return journey. Kaelen looked away from the screen, his jaw set in a hard line, feeling a deep, cold fury at the universe that demanded such prices for survival. He knew that they couldn't go in to get him. To open the inner airlock now would be to vent the radiation into the rest of the station, undoing everything the boy had just died for. They had to leave him there, a silent sentinel in the dark, his sacrifice the only reason the rest of them were still breathing. The restoration of the atmosphere was a slow process, but as the carbon dioxide levels dropped and the emergency lights stabilized, the station began to feel like a living thing again. Kaelen returned to the command deck, which was now filled with the low murmur of systems returning to nominal status. The victory felt hollow, a grim reminder of the cost of their defiance. He looked out at the stars, seeing the distant, cold glints of light that were the Vok'Thar fleet reorganizing in the far reaches of the system. They had bought themselves time, but the enemy was not gone. They were merely waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The human fleet, what was left of it, was busy towing the disabled frigates back to the station's repair docks, their lights like fireflies in the vast, indifferent dark. It was a scene of industrial recovery, a testament to the human refusal to accept defeat even when the foundations of their world were crumbling. Reports from the other colonies were starting to filter in, and the news was grim across the board. The Vok'Thar invasion was a multi-pronged assault, hitting every human outpost simultaneously. It was clear now that this wasn't just a border skirmish, it was an extinction-level event. The High Commander sat at his desk, staring at the casualty lists that were being compiled by the station's central computer. Names of friends, colleagues, and strangers blurred together into a single, overwhelming statistic of loss. He realized then that the station was more than just a military asset. It was a lifeboat, a fragile vessel carrying the genetic and cultural heritage of a species that had nowhere else to go. They were the last of their kind, a collection of survivors who had been pushed to the very edge of the galaxy, and now they were being pushed further. "Commander, we've picked up a localized transmission from the nursery ships," the communications officer said, interrupting Kaelen's thoughts. "They're reporting a malfunction in the cryostasis units. The power fluctuations from the kinetic pulse have disrupted the cooling cycles in Sector 7. If they don't get a stable power feed within the hour, they're going to lose over 400 of the pods." Kaelen felt a surge of adrenaline, the weariness of the last few hours momentarily forgotten. The nursery ships were the future. Without them, all their fighting was for nothing. He looked at the power readings for the station, seeing the thin margin they were working with. They had just stabilized the reactor, and drawing more power now could risk another cascade failure. But the alternative was unthinkable. Divert the auxiliary power from the shield capacitors to the nursery ship link, Kaelen ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "I don't care if it leaves us wide open to another attack. We are not losing those pods." The technicians worked quickly, their fingers flying over the consoles as they rerouted the energy. On the holomap, Kaelen could see the golden thread of the power umbilical stretching out from the station to the distant nursery ships, a literal lifeline in the void. He watched the status indicators for the cryo units, holding his breath as the numbers climbed back into the green. It was another narrow escape, another moment where the margin of survival was measured in single digits. This was the rhythm of their existence, now a constant cycle of crisis and desperate resolution. As the immediate danger to the nursery ships passed, Kaelen took a moment to walk through the observation lounge, one of the few places on the station where one could look out at the void without the distraction of tactical overlays. He saw the stars not as distant suns, but as a vast, uncaring wilderness that humanity was trying to tame with nothing but scrap metal and sheer grit. He thought about Thorn, whose body was still cooling in the reactor room, and about the thousands of others who had died to keep this small pocket of air pressurized. They were a species that had been forged in the fires of their own ambition and destroyed by the very things they had sought to conquer. Yet here they were, still fighting, still building, still refusing to go quietly into the night. It was a beautiful, terrible thing to be human, a state of being that required one to be both a monster and a saint in the same breath. The Vok'Thar were moving again. On the edge of the sensor range, the red dots were fanning out, forming a massive grid that began to close in on the system like a net. They weren't rushing this time. They were being methodical, using their superior numbers to block every possible escape route. Kaelen knew that the station couldn't survive another direct assault in its current state. They were out of missiles, their shields were at 20%, and their most powerful weapon was a one-shot gamble that had already been spent. They needed a new plan, something that didn't rely on raw power or tactical brilliance, but on the one thing humanity had in abundance, a complete lack of regard for what was considered impossible. He called a meeting of the remaining senior officers, his mind already spinning through a dozen different scenarios, each more desperate than the last. They gathered in the darkened briefing room, their faces etched with the fatigue of a war that had no end in sight. Kaelen laid out the situation with brutal honesty, showing them the map of the Vok'Thar net and the dwindling resources of the station. "We can't fight them conventionally," he said, pointing to the massive gap in the enemy formation near the gas giant's gravity well. "And we can't stay here. If we stay, they'll eventually wear us down. Our only option is to use the station itself as a kinetic hammer. We're going to drop the station into the atmosphere of the gas giant, using the gravitational acceleration to punch through their blockade and reach the jump point on the other side. It's a maneuver that shouldn't work, and there's a 60% chance the station will break apart under the atmospheric drag. But if we make it, we'll be out of their reach before they can adjust their trajectories." The room was silent as the officers processed the insanity of the plan. To drop a massive space station into a gas giant's upper atmosphere was a feat of navigation that had never been attempted, let alone with a crippled vessel. But as they looked at the alternatives, slow death by attrition or quick death by plasma fire, the madness began to look like a logical choice. Vahn was the first to speak, a grim smile touching his lips. "It'll require us to strip everything that isn't bolted down to reduce the mass. We'll have to vent the non-essential decks and put everyone into the core. It's going to be a rough ride, Commander, but the math actually checks out if we can keep the structural integrity fields at maximum." The decision was made with a collective nod. There was no time for a formal vote, and there was no need for one. They were all in this together, a group of castaways who had decided to gamble their lives on a desperate toss of the dice. Kaelen gave the orders for the evacuation of the outer rings and the stripping of the station's non-critical components. As the crew began to dismantle their home, there was a sense of grim purpose that permeated the air. They were no longer just defending a station. They were preparing for a final, defiant leap into the unknown. They were taking the fight to the laws of physics themselves, challenging the universe to stop them. Outside, the first of the Vok'Thar harbingers reached the station's outer perimeter, their long-range scanners pulsing like the eyes of a predator. They watched as the human station began to bleed mass, jettisoning cargo containers, spare parts, and entire sections of non-pressurized hull. To the Vok'Thar collective, it must have looked like the humans were finally surrendering, breaking apart under the pressure of the looming assault. But they didn't understand the human capacity for tactical self-mutilation. They didn't see that the humans were shedding their weight so they could run faster and strike harder. As the station ignited its primary thrusters, not to move away from the gas giant, but to dive directly into it, the Vok'Thar fleet was caught completely off guard. The descent was a nightmare of screaming metal and violent turbulence. Inside the core, thousands of people were strapped into whatever they could find, their bodies being crushed by the rapidly increasing G-forces. Kaelen stood on the command deck, his feet locked into the floor magnets, his eyes fixed on the atmospheric density readings. The station was glowing red-hot as it hit the upper layers of the gas giant, the friction of the thick gases turning the hull into a blazing meteor. It was a terrifying, magnificent sight, a man-made sun plunging into a world of clouds. The Vok'Thar ships that tried to follow were caught in the massive wake of the station, their lighter hulls shredded by the turbulence that the human station was barely surviving. Shields at 5%. Vahn's voice was barely audible over the roar of the atmospheric entry. "We are losing the outer plating on the fabrication levels. If we don't level out soon, the core is going to melt." Kaelen watched the altimeter, waiting for the precise second to fire the reverse thrusters. He was playing a game of chicken with a planet, and the planet was winning. But at the last possible moment, he slammed his hand down on the override, and the station's engines roared with a fury that shook the very foundations of the world. The station leveled out, skipping across the denser layers of the atmosphere like a stone across a pond, gaining a massive burst of speed from the gravitational slingshot. They erupted out of the other side of the gas giant's atmosphere, a battered, blackened husk of a station moving at a significant fraction of light speed. The Vok'Thar fleet was left far behind, their heavy obsidian ships unable to match the sudden, violent acceleration of the human maneuver. The jump point was directly ahead, a shimmering tear in the fabric of space that led to the safety of the deep void. Kaelen felt a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph as he watched the jump drives begin their final spin-up. They had done it. They had cheated death one more time, using the very environment that should have destroyed them as their path to freedom. As the station vanished into the fold space, Kaelen took a long, shaky breath, knowing that they were still alive, still fighting, and still undeniably human. The transition into fold space was not the seamless glide promised by the theoretical physicists of the old era. It was a violent, wrenching protest of reality that felt as though the very atoms of the human body were being unspooled and rewoven in the dark. High Commander Kaelen gripped the arms of his command chair, his vision blurring into a kaleidoscope of static as the station, or what was left of it, screamed through the non-space between stars. When the stabilizers finally locked and the artificial gravity hummed back to a steady baseline, the view through the main aperture was no longer of the churning gold clouds of a gas giant, but of the endless, velvet black of the deep void. They were currently in the transit corridor, a temporary reprieve where the Vok'Thar could not reach them, but it was a sanctuary with a rapidly approaching expiration date. The station's hull was scorched, its outer layers stripped away to reveal the skeletal ribbing of the internal structure, making it look more like a ghost ship than a bastion of human ingenuity. Kaelen unbuckled his restraints, his muscles aching from the localized G-force spikes that had nearly turned his skeletal structure into powder. He looked around the command deck and saw a crew that looked less like soldiers and more like survivors of a natural disaster. The air was thin, tasting of copper and the acrid smoke of burnt circuitry, and the lighting was a dim, sickly green as the life support systems struggled to find a stable equilibrium. Despite the physical toll, there was an electric energy in the room, a realization that they had achieved the impossible. They had turned a stationary fortress into a kinetic projectile and survived the friction of a planetary atmosphere. He tapped his console, bringing up the status of the nursery ships that were tethered to their wake. The golden threads of the power umbilicals had held, and the cryopods were reporting nominal temperatures. The future of the species was still intact, though it was currently hanging by a thread of reinforced carbon fiber. Chief Engineer Vahn emerged from the access crawl space, his face smeared with a thick, black lubricant that made him look like a mechanical specter. He held a piece of warped titanium in his hand, a fragment of the primary coolant line that had nearly burst during the slingshot maneuver. His report was delivered in a series of blunt, uncompromising truths. The station's structural integrity was at 40%. The secondary reactors were leaking radiation into the non-essential storage bays, and the fold space drive was vibrating at a frequency that suggested it would liquefy its own housing if they stayed in transit for more than 48 hours. They were moving at speeds that defied conventional measurement, yet they were essentially a sinking ship in a sea of nothingness. Vahn's eyes, however, were not filled with despair, but with the manic intensity of a man who had found a new problem to solve. He suggested that they use the transit time to perform a hot weld of the entire hull, using the residual heat from the atmospheric entry to fuse the loose plating back into a single, cohesive shell. The logistics of a hot weld in fold space were terrifying. It required teams of technicians to exit the pressurized core and work on the exterior of the station while the very fabric of spacetime was warping around them. In fold space, there was no vacuum in the traditional sense. There was only a shimmering field of energy that reacted violently to the presence of matter. If a worker drifted more than 3 meters from the hull, they wouldn't just drift away, they would be erased, their molecular structure scattered across 10,000 different points in the galaxy. Kaelen weighed the risk against the certainty of the station falling apart upon re-entry into real space. He knew that the Vok'Thar would be waiting at the other end of the corridor, having calculated their exit vector with the cold precision of a hive mind. If they arrived as a broken husk, the fight would be over in seconds. He gave the order to proceed, authorizing the use of every available magnetic tether and heavy-duty welding rig on the station. The exterior work began with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. From the command deck monitors, Kaelen watched the tiny, flickering lights of the welding torches as they moved across the darkened hull like stars dancing on the surface of a black pond. The technicians were tethered by thick, vibrating cables that hummed with the energy of the fold space field. They worked in pairs, one man holding the plates in place with a magnetic clamp, while the other fused them together with a concentrated beam of ionized plasma. It was a ballet of industrial necessity, performed in a place where no human was ever meant to exist. Every now and then, a flare of blue energy would erupt from the hull as the welding arcs interacted with the transit field, casting long, distorted shadows across the metal. They were literalizing the metaphor of humanity, welding themselves together in the dark, trying to become something stronger than the sum of their broken parts. During the third hour of the repairs, a containment breach occurred on the lower fabrication deck. A pressurized gas line, weakened by the stress of the atmospheric dive, snapped and began to vent high-pressure nitrogen into the crawl spaces where a team of 6 mechanics were working. Kaelen watched the internal monitors as the room filled with a white, freezing fog, the temperature dropping instantly to levels that would shatter human bone. The mechanics were trapped, their exit blocked by a jammed hydraulic door that had been warped by the station's torque. There was no time to send a rescue team, and the manual override was unresponsive. Kaelen felt the familiar, cold weight of command settling over him again. He could either let the gas continue to vent, which would eventually drain the station's entire nitrogen reserve and kill everyone, or he could vent that specific compartment into the fold space void, sacrificing the 6 men to save the rest. "Commander, we can't reach the manual shutoff." The voice of one of the mechanics came over the comms, surprisingly calm despite the fact that his suit was already frosting over. "The pressure is building. If the tank blows, it'll take the whole fabrication wing with it. You have to vent the sector." It was a request for execution, delivered with the same professional detachment one might use to report a faulty sensor. Kaelen looked at the names on the monitor, men who had served under him for years, men who had children on the nursery ships. He didn't hesitate, for hesitation was a luxury he had lost a long time ago. He entered the authorization code and pulled the lever. The monitor showed a sudden, violent expansion of white gas as the outer hatch blew open, and for a fraction of a second, the 6 figures were visible as they were swept out into the shimmering abyss. Then they were gone, consumed by the non-space as if they had never existed. Kaelen closed his eyes for a single heartbeat, then turned back to the tactical display. The nitrogen levels had stabilized. The station would survive another hour. As the transit continued, the psychological toll on the crew began to manifest in quiet, subtle ways. The constant vibration of the fold space drive, a low-frequency thrum that bypassed the ears and settled directly in the marrow, was driving people to the edge of madness. There were reports of hallucinations, people seeing the faces of the dead in the flickering lights or hearing the voices of lost loved ones in the hiss of the ventilation. This was the void sickness, a well-documented phenomenon of long-range transit that humanity had never quite conquered. They were a species evolved for the solid ground and the blue sky, and being suspended in a dimension of pure abstraction was a violation of their fundamental biology. Kaelen found himself staring at his own reflection in the darkened glass of the aperture, wondering if the man looking back was still the same person who had left the inner colonies so many years ago. He felt like a ghost haunting a machine, a collection of memories and duties held together by a fading pulse. In the middle of the second day, the long-range sensors picked up an anomaly within the fold space corridor. It shouldn't have been possible. The corridor was supposed to be a private tunnel through the void, yet there was a mass shadow trailing them, a persistent ripple in the energy field that matched their speed and trajectory. The Vok'Thar had found a way to follow them into the non-space. This was a catastrophic development that changed the nature of the war. If the enemy could track them through fold space, there was no hiding, no escape, and no way to regroup. The realization hit the command deck like a physical blow. The Vok'Thar weren't just a biological swarm, they were evolving, learning from human technology and adapting it to their own collective ends. The shadow was closing the distance, a jagged obsidian shape that seemed to absorb the shimmering light of the corridor. "We can't fight them in here," Vahn said, his voice urgent as he looked at the sensor data. "If we fire any weapons, the energy discharge will collapse the corridor and dump us both into deep space, light years from the nearest star. We'll be stranded in the dark forever." Kaelen nodded, his mind racing. He knew that the Vok'Thar were likely aware of this limitation as well. They weren't trying to destroy the station in fold space. They were trying to latch onto it, to become a parasite that would emerge with them in real space. It was a boarding action on a galactic scale. The obsidian shadow moved closer, and a series of organic-looking tendrils began to extend from its forward hull, reaching out for the station's exposed structural ribs. Kaelen ordered the station to begin a series of micropulsations in the fold space drive. It was a dangerous maneuver that put immense strain on the already damaged stabilizers, but it caused the station to jitter within the corridor, making it difficult for the Vok'Thar ship to gain a solid lock. The two vessels engaged in a slow-motion dance of geometry and physics, two predators circling each other in a dimension where movement was a matter of intent rather than thrust. Every time the Vok'Thar tendrils got close, Kaelen would shift the station's phase, causing the obsidian limbs to pass through the hull as if it were a ghost. It was a test of endurance and concentration, a battle fought with slide rules and gravitational constants. Kaelen felt the sweat dripping down his neck, the air in the command deck becoming increasingly foul as the scrubbers failed to keep up with the stress-induced carbon dioxide output of the crew. "They're matching our phase," the tactical officer warned, her voice tight with panic. "They're learning the rhythm. In 3 minutes, they'll have a permanent lock, and we won't be able to shake them." Kaelen looked at the fold space drive readings, seeing that they were only 10 minutes away from the scheduled exit point. If they emerged with the Vok'Thar ship attached, the station would be boarded and overrun before the jump drive could even cool down. He needed a way to sever the connection, something that would push the enemy ship away without collapsing the entire corridor. He looked at the diagram of the station's power grid and saw the massive capacitors that had been used for the kinetic pulse. They were empty, but the station's hull was currently acting as a giant lightning rod, soaking up the ambient energy of the fold space field. "Vahn, can we reverse the polarity of the hull's magnetic field?" Kaelen asked, the idea forming even as he spoke. "If we dump the entire residual charge of the atmospheric friction into the outer plating all at once, can we create a localized repulsion field?" Vahn stared at the console, his fingers flying as he calculated the potential energy. "It would burn out every sensor on the exterior. We'd be flying blind when we exit, and there's a chance it'll cook the internal wiring. But it would create a massive electromagnetic kick. It would be like hitting them with a hammer made of pure magnetism." Kaelen didn't hesitate. "Do it, on my mark." He watched the obsidian ship draw closer, its tendrils finally making contact with the station's outer hull with a sickening metallic screech that vibrated through the entire structure. "Mark," Kaelen shouted. Vahn slammed his hand onto the activation sequence. The station erupted in a blinding halo of white-hot energy as the stored charge was released into the hull. The Vok'Thar ship, which had been using its own magnetic grapples to stay attached, was suddenly repelled with a force that defied the laws of inertia. The obsidian vessel was hurled backward, its structural bonds snapping as it was pushed into the unstable walls of the fold space corridor. For a moment, it glowed with a terrifying brilliance as it began to disintegrate, and then it simply vanished, consumed by the non-space as the corridor rippled from the impact. The station shuddered, the lights on the command deck exploding in a shower of sparks, leaving them in total darkness. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and the faint, dying whine of the electronics. Then, the emergency lights flickered on, revealing a command deck that was a ruin of melted plastic and shattered glass. Kaelen pulled himself up from the floor, his hands bleeding from where he had gripped the console. He looked at the main view screen, which was cracked but still functional. They were still in fold space, but the countdown to exit was at 0. The station began to moan as it prepared to re-enter real space, the violent transition shaking the remaining hull plates loose. With a final bone-jarring thud, the shimmering field vanished, and the station emerged into the cold, silent light of a new star system. They were in the outer rim of a binary star system, a place of jagged asteroids and swirling dust clouds. It was a desolate, lonely part of the galaxy, but for the moment, it was empty. The Vok'Thar were nowhere to be seen. Kaelen looked at the sensor readings, which were slowly coming back online. The nursery ships were still with them, their hulls scorched but intact. They had survived the transit, they had defeated their pursuer, and they had reached a place where they could, for a moment, catch their breath. But as Kaelen looked at the status of the station, he knew the victory was bittersweet. They were 1,000 light-years from any known human outpost, Their ship was a wreck, and they were out of fuel. They were the last of their kind, drifting in a graveyard of their own making. "Commander," the communications officer said, her voice trembling, "I'm picking up a signal. It's not Vok'Thar. It's a human beacon, an old one. It's coming from the third planet in this system." Kaelen felt a jolt of shock. This sector was supposed to be uninhabited, a dead zone that had never been charted during the Great Migration. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the tiny, pulsing dot on the sensor screen. A human beacon meant a base, a colony, or at the very least, a cache of supplies. It was a ghost of the past reaching out to them in their darkest hour. He looked at his crew, seeing the same flicker of hope in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. They weren't alone. They were still part of something larger, a lineage that had planted seeds across the stars, even in the face of their own destruction. "Set a course for the third planet," Kaelen ordered. His voice regained its strength. "Use the remaining RCS thrusters. We are going down." They began the slow, agonizing crawl toward the planet, a battered, blackened station carrying the last hope of a billion souls toward a mystery that had been waiting for them in the dark for centuries. As they drew closer, Kaelen could see the planet was a beautiful, vibrant world of green and blue, a twin of the Earth they had lost so long ago. It was a miracle of coincidence, or perhaps something more. As the station entered the planet's orbit, Kaelen realized that their journey wasn't ending, it was just beginning a new chapter. They had been architects of the void, and now they would have to learn how to be architects of the Earth once again. The descent toward the third planet was a slow, agonizing crawl that tested the final remnants of the station's structural integrity. Unlike the violent, fire-streaked plunge into the gas giant, this was a delicate maneuver of orbital decay, managed by a skeleton crew using a patchwork of failing thrusters. High Commander Kaelen stood at the observation port, watching the sphere of the world grow from a marble of sapphire into a sprawling landscape of emerald continents and vast, churning oceans. It was a sight that felt like a biological hallucination. After decades in the sterile, metallic confines of deep space outposts, the sheer vibrancy of the planet was an assault on the senses. The air in the command deck was quiet, the usual frantic clicking of keys replaced by a heavy, reverent hush as the survivors looked upon a world that appeared to be a pristine mirror of their ancestral home. The beacon continued its rhythmic pulse, a steady heartbeat emanating from a mountain range nestled deep within the northern hemisphere, calling them down to a surface that promised either salvation or a final resting place. As the station settled into a stable low orbit, the sensor arrays, now barely functional after the electromagnetic purge in fold space, began to resolve the details of the beacon's origin. It wasn't just a simple transmitter, it was a sprawling industrial complex, half-buried under centuries of tectonic shifts and overgrowth. The architecture was unmistakably human, but belonged to an era that preceded the Great Migration by centuries. These were the ruins of the first expansion, a period of history that had been largely erased during the internal collapses and resource wars that had nearly extinguished the species before they ever left the Sol system. Kaelen felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. If this colony had existed for hundreds of years, why had it remained silent while the rest of humanity was being hunted to the brink of extinction? The planet was a paradise, yet it showed no signs of active terraforming or atmospheric management. It was a cradle that appeared to have been abandoned by its occupants, leaving only the automated machinery to sing to the stars. The logistics of landing the remaining population were overwhelming. The station was far too damaged to attempt a controlled atmospheric entry and subsequent landing. It would simply break apart into 1,000 pieces of molten slag. The only solution was a massive evacuation using the nursery ships and the remaining short-range transport shuttles. Kaelen oversaw the process with a grim, practiced efficiency, coordinating the transfer of thousands of cryopods from the station's core to the shuttle bays. He watched the first wave of transports depart, their silver hulls glinting as they caught the light of the binary suns. It was a migration in miniature, a desperate leap from a dying shell to an uncertain future. Among the refugees were the technicians, the soldiers, and the children who had never walked on solid ground, all of them carrying the weight of a civilization that had forgotten what it felt like to have a horizon that didn't end in a bulkhead. Kaelen himself took the final shuttle, leaving the command deck of the station for the last time. As the craft pulled away, he looked back at the fortress that had been his home and his prison for half a lifetime. It looked pathetic in the light of the suns, a charred, lopsided hunk of metal that was already beginning to tumble as its stabilization gyros finally gave out. It had done its duty, shielding them from the vacuum and the Vok'Thar, but its time had passed. The shuttle's descent was smooth, the computer handling the transition through the thick, oxygen-rich atmosphere with a grace that the station could never have achieved. When the craft finally touched down in a valley of towering, amber-colored flora, the sound of the engines cutting out was followed by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Kaelen waited for the pressure equalization cycle to finish, his heart hammering against his ribs, then stepped out onto the ramp and into the air of a world that had been waiting for him. The air was sweet, smelling of damp earth and 1,000 unfamiliar pollens. Kaelen took a deep breath, the richness of the oxygen making his head swim for a moment. He looked around at the valley, where several other shuttles had already landed. People were emerging from the crafts, some falling to their knees to touch the soil, others standing in stunned silence as they stared at the sky. There were no Vok'Thar here, no alarms, and no hunger. Yet the sense of unease remained. He looked toward the mountain where the beacon was located, its jagged peaks shrouded in a perpetual silver mist. He knew that their survival on this world depended on what they found in those ruins. They needed power, they needed medicine, and they needed to know why this place was empty. He organized a small scouting party, including Chief Engineer Vahn and a handful of security personnel, and began the long trek toward the ancient colony. The journey on foot was a grueling reminder of how much their bodies had changed over generations of low-gravity living. Even with the assistance of their hard suits, the steady pull of the planet's gravity was a constant drain on their stamina. They moved through forests of trees that resembled giant ferns, their leaves a deep, translucent purple that captured the light of the binary stars. There were no animals to be seen, no birds in the sky, and no insects in the undergrowth. The world was vibrant and lush, yet it felt strangely hollow, like a stage set waiting for the actors to arrive. Vahn kept his handheld scanner active, tracking the beacon's signal and monitoring the atmospheric composition. "Everything is perfect, Commander," the engineer whispered, his voice echoing in the quiet. "Too perfect. The nitrogen-oxygen balance, the humidity, the trace minerals. It's as if this entire ecosystem was designed in a laboratory to be the ideal human habitat. But there's no biological diversity. It's a monoculture on a planetary scale." As they reached the base of the mountain, the first signs of the first expansion colony appeared. It was a massive archway of reinforced concrete and carbon steel, overgrown with creeping vines that had thick, woody stems. The words Project Genesis were still visible, etched into the lintel in a font that felt ancient and alien to the eyes of the survivors. Beyond the archway lay a series of domes and towers that had been carved directly into the mountain's granite face. The architecture was brutalist and functional, designed to last for millennia. They entered the main plaza, where the dust of centuries lay thick on the ground, undisturbed by wind or rain. In the center of the plaza stood a statue of a man and a woman looking up at the stars, their hands outstretched in a gesture of hope that felt bitterly ironic given the current state of the human race. Inside the primary command center, the air was stale but breathable. Vahn moved to a central console that was still glowing with a dim, amber light, his fingers tracing the ancient interfaces with a mixture of awe and trepidation. With a series of hesitant commands, he managed to wake the system from its long slumber. The room hummed to life, holograms flickering into existence above the dusty floor. They were not tactical maps or resource charts, they were records of a biological experiment. Kaelen watched as the data scrolled by, revealing the truth of Project Genesis. This planet hadn't been found, it had been built. The first expansion scientists had used early terraforming technology to create a Cradle World, a backup for humanity in case the Earth fell. But they had realized too late that a perfect environment was a biological dead end. Without the pressures of competition, predation, and environmental stress, the colonists had simply stopped. The records detailed a slow, peaceful decline. There had been no war, no famine, and no plague. The colonists had lived in total comfort, their every need met by the automated systems of the mountain. But over generations, their drive to innovate, to explore, and to survive had withered away. They had stopped having children, not out of necessity, but out of a lack of interest. They had become a species of ghosts, living out their days in a dream of perfection until the last one simply fell asleep and didn't wake up. The Vok'Thar had never found this place, because there was no conflict here to draw their attention, no radio leakage of a frantic civilization, just the quiet hum of a machine tending to a graveyard. Kaelen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was the fate that awaited them if they stopped fighting, not a violent end at the hands of an alien swarm, but a slow, quiet dissolution into nothingness. "Commander, look at this," Vahn said, pointing to a submenu in the archives. "The automated systems, they aren't just maintaining the atmosphere, they're a forge." The lower levels of this mountain are filled with fabrication units, seed banks, and even a small shipyard. It's all still functional. The first expansion didn't just leave us a home, they left us a factory. Kaelen realized then that this was the weapon they had been looking for. The Vok'Thar won because they were a collective that never stopped growing, never stopped consuming. To beat them, humanity didn't just need better ships. They needed to reclaim their own nature as builders and conquerors. They needed to turn this cradle into a fortress. But as he looked at the screens, Kaelen also saw a warning. The Vok'Thar were coming. The beacon that had drawn the humans here had also been detected by the swarm's long-range sensors. The Obsidian fleet was already shifting its course, drawn by the sudden surge of power as the mountain woke up. They had perhaps a month, maybe less, before the sky turned red again. The peace of the valley was a lie, a brief moment of calm before the final storm. Kaelen turned to his team, his eyes hard and filled with a new, dangerous purpose. "We aren't here to rest," he said, his voice echoing through the hollow halls of the mountain. "We are here to work. We have 30 days to turn this planet into a trap. We're going to use everything the first expansion left behind, and we're going to show the Vok'Thar what happens when you corner a species that has spent its entire history learning how to kill the things that try to eat it." The work began that night. The survivors were moved from the valley into the mountain, their exhaustion replaced by the frantic energy of a people who finally had the tools to fight back. They stripped the ancient machines for parts, repurposed the fabrication units to build orbital mines, and began the process of weaponizing the very atmosphere of the planet. Kaelen oversaw it all, a man who had traded his role as a commander for that of an architect of war. He knew that the Vok'Thar would expect a desperate, broken remnant. Instead, they were going to find a world that had been turned into a hornet's nest of high-tensile steel and nuclear fire. As he stood on the balcony of the command center, looking out at the binary suns setting over the valley, Kaelen felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Humanity was no longer just surviving, they were preparing to reclaim the stars. The atmosphere of the planet, once a serene blanket of sapphire and gold, had become a churning arena of industrial preparation. High Commander Kaelen stood on the observation balcony of the mountain fortress, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the dual suns were being eclipsed by the rising silhouettes of massive orbital defense platforms. These were not the hastily repaired wrecks of the migration fleet. They were the firstborn of the Project Genesis forges, constructs of polished alloy and concentrated power that hummed with a lethality the human race had not possessed for centuries. Below him, the valley had been transformed into a sprawling assembly yard where automated drones moved with insect-like precision, welding together the components of a new kind of warship. These vessels were designed with a singular, brutal philosophy. They were essentially engines wrapped in armor, built to deliver the maximum amount of kinetic energy to a target while withstanding the gravitational shear of a collapsing star. Humanity had stopped trying to build homes in the void. They were building hammers. Chief Engineer Vahn approached Kaelen, his stride more confident than it had been in months. The environmental stress of the planet had done what no medicine could, revitalizing the weary crew and giving them a physical robustness they had lacked in the cramped quarters of the station. Vahn presented a data tablet that detailed the progress of the planetary shield, a massive network of geothermal taps and ion projectors designed to turn the entire atmosphere into an impenetrable barrier of ionized gas. This was the Aegis Protocol, a theory found in the first expansion archives that had never been tested on this scale. If successful, the Vok'Thar would find themselves slamming into a wall of plasma that would strip away their obsidian hulls before they could even enter the stratosphere. Vahn's eyes gleamed with the fervor of a man who had been given the keys to a kingdom of pure potential, yet his report was tempered by the reality of the timeline. The Vok'Thar vanguard was less than 48 hours from the system's edge. The human population was no longer a collection of refugees. They had been reorganized into a total war society. Those who were not operating the forges were training in the high-G simulators or learning the intricacies of the new swarm drone command interfaces. Even the children were involved, their small hands helping to calibrate the delicate sensor arrays that would be seeded throughout the asteroid belt. There was a grim, shared understanding that this was the final stand. There were no more hidden cradles, no more forgotten colonies. If they lost here, the human story would end as a brief, violent footnote in the history of the galaxy. Kaelen felt this weight every time he looked at the faces of his people, but he also felt a burgeoning pride. They had taken the passive, decaying legacy of the first expansion and infused it with the savage, desperate vitality of the migration. They were a hybrid civilization now, possessing the wisdom of the old world and the ruthlessness of the new. As the first Vok'Thar probes were detected entering the system, Kaelen moved the command center to the deepest level of the mountain, a vaulted chamber of reinforced granite and lead-lined sensors. The tactical holomap was no longer a sea of red dots. It was a complex web of gravity wells, minefields, and hidden weapons platforms. He watched as the Vok'Thar fleet transitioned out of fold space, a black tide of obsidian ships that seemed to blot out the light of the binary stars. This was not a probing force. It was the main hive body, a force of millions that moved with a collective, terrifying grace. They did not slow down to investigate the system. They moved directly toward the third planet with the momentum of an avalanche. Kaelen felt the familiar chill of combat adrenaline, but this time it was accompanied by a cold, calculating hunger. He wanted them to come closer. He wanted them to believe that the humans were still the prey they had been hunting across the void. The engagement began not with a volley of fire, but with a ripple of gravitational distortion. As the Vok'Thar fleet passed the second planet, a gas giant similar to the one they had used for their escape, the humans detonated a series of mass driver charges hidden within the planet's ring system. Thousands of tons of ice and rock were hurled into the path of the advancing swarm, moving at speeds that turned even a pebble into a mountain-crushing projectile. The Vok'Thar, caught in the sudden debris field, were forced to adjust their trajectories, breaking their tight formation and exposing their flanks. It was a classic human tactic, using the environment as a force multiplier. The Obsidian ships tried to compensate, their bioluminescent engines flaring as they pushed through the storm of ice, but the damage was already done. The cohesion of the hive was fractured, and for the first time, the collective mind of the enemy seemed to hesitate. "Initiate the Aegis Protocol," Kaelen commanded, his voice amplified by the silent intensity of the room. Across the planet's surface, the geothermal taps roared to life, drawing power from the very core of the world. Great beams of emerald light shot up from the mountain peaks, intersecting in the upper atmosphere to create a shimmering grid of energy. The sky turned a brilliant, terrifying white as the nitrogen and oxygen were energized into a state of high-energy plasma. To the Vok'Thar, the planet must have looked as if it had suddenly transformed into a small, angry star. The vanguard of the swarm, unable to arrest their momentum, slammed into the shield. The result was a massacre of physics. The Obsidian ships did not just break, they vaporized, their structural bonds shredded by the thermal and electrical intensity of the barrier. It was a display of defensive power that defied everything the Vok'Thar knew about planetary conquest. But the hive was nothing if not adaptable. Seeing the futility of a direct atmospheric entry, the Vok'Thar fleet pulled back, fanning out into a massive sphere that surrounded the planet just beyond the range of the shield. They began to deploy long-range kinetic harpoons, not to pull the planet, but to anchor themselves to the gravitational well so they could begin a systematic bombardment of the shield generators. Kaelen watched as the red dots on the map shifted into a siege formation. This was the moment he had prepared for, the transition from the defensive to the offensive. He looked at the secondary tactical display, which showed the status of the new Sun fleet, currently hidden behind the dark side of the planet's moon. These were the ships built in the Genesis forges, and they were commanded by the same pilots who had survived the retreat from the station. "Launch the strike force," Kaelen ordered. From behind the moon, 300 human warships erupted into the void, their engines burning with a brilliant, blue-white flame. They did not approach the Vok'Thar fleet in a standard line. They moved in a complex, overlapping pattern of microjumps, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. This was a new technology, a miniaturized version of the fold space drive that allowed for tactical teleportation over short distances. The Vok'Thar, whose weapon systems relied on tracking long-term trajectories, found themselves firing at shadows. The human ships would appear within the very heart of the enemy formation, release a devastating volley of railgun fire and nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and then vanish before the Obsidian ships could return fire. It was a war of 1,000 stabs, a demonstration of human mobility and technological audacity. The battle raged for hours, the space around the planet filled with the debris of shattered obsidian and the expanding clouds of human wreckage. Kaelen watched as his pilots performed maneuvers that pushed the limits of biological endurance, their bodies subjected to crushing G-forces as they blinked through the void. He saw individual acts of heroism that would never be recorded, a pilot steering his crippled ship into the engine core of a Vok'Thar carrier, a technician staying behind on a failing defense platform to ensure the last missile was fired. This was the true strength of humanity, the ability of the individual to act with a purpose that surpassed the needs of the collective. The Vok'Thar were 1 billion minds acting as one, but the humans were 1,000 minds acting with 1 billion different sparks of ingenuity. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The obsidian sphere was buckling, the relentless pressure of the human counterattack forcing the hive to retreat further into the system. In the heat of the conflict, Vahn alerted Kaelen to a new development. The Vok'Thar flagship, a mountain-sized vessel of ancient, reinforced obsidian, was moving toward the planet's suns. It wasn't retreating, it was positioning itself to trigger a stellar collapse. The Vok'Thar had realized they could not take the planet, so they had decided to destroy the entire system. It was a final, spiteful act of a species that refused to accept defeat. Kaelen looked at the distance and the energy readings. If the flagship reached the primary sun, the resulting supernova would wipe out everything within 10 light years. The human fleet was too far away to intercept, and the planetary shield was not designed to withstand a stellar explosion. He felt a moment of cold, absolute clarity. They had built a fortress, they had fought a war, and now they were facing the end of everything they had worked for. "We have one option," Vahn whispered, his face pale in the light of the screens. "The fold space drive on the station, we never dismantled it. It's still in orbit, tethered to the Aegis network. If we can overload the drive and shunt the energy through the shield projectors, we can create a localized fold space bubble around the sun. It won't stop the explosion, but it will trap it in a non-spatial pocket. The sun will be gone, but the planet might survive in the dark." Kaelen looked at the math, seeing the terrifying margin of error. It would require someone to manually calibrate the drive on the drifting station, right in the path of the Vok'Thar flagship's path. It was a suicide mission that made Thorn's sacrifice in the reactor look like a walk in the park. Before Kaelen could even ask for volunteers, a signal came through from the station. It was the communications officer who had stayed behind to monitor the orbital sensors. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stated that she was already at the drive core, her voice steady and devoid of fear. She began the countdown, her words a rhythmic cadence that filled the command center. Kaelen stood at attention, his hand over his heart, as he watched the station begin to glow with a familiar, shimmering light. The Vok'Thar flagship fired its main beams, but it was too late. The station erupted in a cataclysmic burst of fold space energy, and for a heartbeat, the primary sun vanished, replaced by a swirling, black void. The flagship, caught in the gravitational backdraft, was pulled into the pocket and erased from existence. The system was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the distant, smaller secondary sun. The planet shuddered as its orbital mechanics were violently altered by the loss of the primary mass, but the Aegis shield held, protecting the atmosphere from the worst of the gravitational shockwaves. The Vok'Thar fleet, their collective minds shattered by the loss of their flagship and the sudden change in the stellar environment, began to drift and dissipate, the survivors fleeing into the deep void. The battle was over. The humans had won, but the cost was the light of their world. Kaelen looked up at the darkened sky, seeing the stars more clearly than ever before. They were alone in the dark, a planet of survivors orbiting a dying ember, but they were still there. They had survived the crucible, and in the process, they had become something more than they had ever been. The darkness that followed the disappearance of the primary sun was not the cold, empty void of space, but a heavy, expectant twilight that settled over the planet. High Commander Kaelen stood upon the frost-rimmed observation deck of the mountain, his breath blooming in the cooling air. The secondary sun, a distant and pale companion, offered only a ghost of the warmth they had once known, casting long, violet shadows across a landscape that was rapidly entering a forced hibernation. Yet the world below was far from dead. From the heights of the mountain, the valley was a sea of artificial light, a sprawling grid of neon and amber where the reconstruction of the human species had entered its final, most ambitious phase. They had survived the Vok'Thar, they had survived the collapse of their solar system, and now they were engaged in the most difficult survival of all, the transition from a species defined by war to one defined by endurance. Inside the command center, the atmosphere had shifted from the frantic energy of a bunker to the steady, rhythmic pulse of a shipyard. Chief Engineer Vahn was no longer hunched over weapons consoles. He was supervising the construction of the World Engine, a massive network of fusion reactors and gravity anchors designed to stabilize the planet's orbit and provide the artificial warmth needed to sustain the biosphere. The technology was a synthesis of first expansion theory and the desperate, jury-rigged engineering that had kept the migration fleet alive. They were effectively turning the entire planet into a ship, a vessel capable of navigating the long night of the interstellar void. Vahn's face was etched with lines of deep exhaustion, but there was a quiet, luminous pride in his eyes. He reported that the internal heat sinks were holding and that the first of the underground agricultural domes had achieved a self-sustaining cycle. Humanity was no longer dependent on the whims of a star. They had seized the means of their own existence. The human population had adapted with a speed that bordered on the evolutionary. In the permanent twilight of the surface, a new culture was beginning to take root, one that valued the resilience of the mind and the precision of the hand above all else. The soldiers had become builders, the pilots had become navigators of the orbital grid, and the children were growing up in a world where the stars were not distant lights of hope, but destinations that would one day be reached. There was no talk of a return to Earth, for Earth was a memory of a different kind of human. These people were the descendants of the vacuum and the forge, a lineage that had been tempered by the absolute zero of the void and the white-hot heat of the kinetic pulse. They were a species of iron, and they were beginning to realize that the darkness was not their enemy, but their sanctuary. Kaelen spent his days walking through the lower levels of the mountain, which had become a labyrinth of industry and life. He saw the fabrication units churning out the components for the new exploration frigates, ships that would be sent out not to flee, but to find other remnants of the human race and bring them home to this new bastion. He visited the nurseries where the infants born on this new world were being raised, their eyes bright with a curiosity that had not been dulled by the trauma of the war. He felt a profound sense of closure. The burden he had carried since the first Vok'Thar alarm had finally been lifted, replaced by a duty to the future. He was no longer a commander of a garrison, but a steward of a beginning. He knew that the Vok'Thar would never return to this system. To the collective, this was a place of ghosts and impossible physics, a sector of space that had been marked as a graveyard for their kind. On the anniversary of the Great Slingshot, Kaelen gathered the survivors in the central plaza of the mountain. There were no grand ceremonies or speeches of victory, for the cost of their survival was written in the silence of the billions who had not made it. Instead, they stood together in the soft, violet glow of the secondary sun, a collection of souls who had stared into the mouth of extinction and refused to blink. Kaelen looked out at the faces of his people, the scarred, the weary, and the young, and he saw the true legacy of Project Genesis. It wasn't the machines or the archives, it was the capacity of the human spirit to find a way through the dark, to weld hope out of the wreckage of despair. He spoke only a few words, his voice carrying through the crisp air with a weight that needed no amplification. "We are the architects of the long night, and we shall not be moved." As the first of the world engines roared to life, sending a hum through the bedrock of the mountain that felt like the heartbeat of a titan, Kaelen returned to the observation deck. He watched as the planetary shield was deactivated, replaced by a shimmering web of navigation lights that marked the planet's new course through the galaxy. They were moving out of the ruins of their old system, heading toward a cluster of young stars where a new future could be built. He looked up at the blackness, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel small. He felt the immense, terrifying power of a species that had learned how to breathe in the void and walk through fire. Humanity was no longer a victim of the universe's indifference. They were an active participant in its evolution, a spark of consciousness that refused to be extinguished. The final report of the day came from the long-range arrays, which were now picking up faint, rhythmic pulses from the deep void, not the hostile signals of the Vok'Thar, but the unmistakable, messy, and beautiful signatures of human radio leakage from distant, hidden colonies. They were not the only ones who had survived. The galaxy was full of embers, waiting to be gathered into a fire. Kaelen smiled, a rare and genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. He watched as the new exploration fleet ignited their engines, their blue-white trails cutting through the twilight like needles stitching the fabric of the dark back together. The war was over, the cradle was secure, and the journey was just beginning.